Okay, so we are up to page 18, and we had we gone into what's called the sin offering of the high priest is what the section begins. So I just want to approach this because when we reading it inside and I looked at the translation, which I think is really very good, but I guess at least in this one, I think to me it comes across quite confusing in the way they wrote it. I don't know if they had a choice, if I could have done any better myself, but I just don't want us to be confused. So this first section, this beginning, we're doing the third book of the Torah, and I said the Torah had led us to a point where there's the Jewish people, and then they're still in the Sinai desert, but because they've gotten the Torah, and God says to them, build the tabernacle, which is a central place of worship to God, of connecting with God, which in hundreds of years will eventually be transformed into the Holy Temple, which is in Jerusalem. Right now, it's a portable, collapsible, buildable sanctuary that they take with them in the desert. When they're traveling, the pieces go onto wagons, big wagons, and when they camp, they take off the wagons, they set it up. And then, so the third book of the Torah talks about the services of connection with God. And the Hebrew word is korban, which is commonly translated as sacrifice, and I understand why, but the word korban itself in the linguistics of it, the etymology of it, means coming close. It's a coming close mechanism. It's a way for us to come close with God. Now, in what's specified in the Torah as a mechanism to come close with God happens to be with offerings on an altar, but it's all about the coming close. So the first offerings described in this third book of the Torah, Leviticus, Vayikra, are voluntary offerings. So you love someone, you don't only give them what your unspoken contract has in mind, that where I provide this and you provide that. You love someone, sometimes you want to show your love and you do something special, unexpected. And that's the offerings that we spoke about before. It's the voluntary free will and goodwill thanks offerings, gratitude offerings, things that we bring to God. Then we're going to get into over here the offerings that are obligatory, and we had started talking about it already. And we start off an offering that is offerings for unintentional violations. Now, and then we're going to go forward. It says here the sin offering the high priest. The Torah is going to lay out very shortly. We may not get to it today, but it's within the next few verses. We're starting at verse 2. On this, I'm in verse 1, but we're at verse 2. This is the beginning of chapter 4. It starts talking about the offering for violations, unintentional violations, but it's really what seems to be bundled together here at some level is what happens if you or I feel that we need to go or have actually done something unintended, that a violation of Torah law. It was unintentional, and we want to try and repair this with God, search ourselves, and bring an offering. That's we're as private citizens. Then there is the idea of what happens if the high priest or the king does it, and then there's the questions of what if the great court, known as the Sanhedrin, if they make a mistake. And so all of this is going to be bundled together. And those are two very different ideas, the idea of an individual. Then there's the idea of leadership and leadership owning up to its mistakes. So let's start off with the individual. And I just want to talk about it a little bit. There's a few ideas that we need to unpack here. First of all, there's the idea of an individual doing something wrong. And then there's the idea of an individual doing something wrong inadvertently. So in Torah thinking, and I think we've discussed this at different times, in Torah thinking, the very idea that we can do something that violates our relationship with God, that hurts our relationship with God, is itself something odd. A matter of fact, we have here the language that we're reading here in verse 2. And the language is, in the Hebrew, would say, when a soul sins. And the Zohar, the fundamental textbook of mysticism, of Kabbalah, says on that, nefesh kisechtas, the Hebrew that from this language, when a soul sins, and its response to that in the Zohar is one Aramaic word, tvoha. It's astonishing. It's astonishing that someone could do something to hurt their relationship with God, hurt themselves, and tamper with the relationship with God. And how does that happen? We can look around us, we can look in the news, we look at ourselves. We see sometimes really smart people do really not smart things that are counterproductive, self-destructive to themselves. And why do they do that? Because they're not thinking straight. It's because they get swept up in appetite, emotion, a lust for power, a lust for self-satisfaction, and people do things where if they would just stop and pause and take a deep breath and think, here's my life, here's what's really important to me, and this thing can actually, this next action that I'm passionate about and I'm contemplating and I want to do, that can threaten everything. Why would you do that? Yet people do it all the time. And why is that? In the language of the Talmud, we say that, we've had it here, that a person only does something, well, a person only tampers with a relationship with God, or really what it means is people only do things that are self-destructive when, in the language of the Talmud, when a spirit of foolishness has entered their head. And the spirit of foolishness can be this thinking, it's like this, I have this opportunity for something, and I have and the passion is overriding, and I'm not using my calm, objective analysis to say, the risk is too great. I'm just not going to go for that, to attempt that objective that seems so tantalizing, because if something goes wrong, my life as I know it is on the line. Why would anyone want to jeopardize that? So the idea that a soul, meaning us, each and every one of us, that we would do something that the Torah calls a violation, which means, and we think it in framing of someone who really, really matters to you, and there are expectations, and there are understandings of what is considered honoring the relationship, what's considered dishonoring the relationship, and the dishonoring of the relationship, you think, is whatever it is. If it's a relationship that really matters, why would we risk it? And therefore, the idea that a soul would do something like this, if we truly value a relationship with God, is itself curious. And now here we call it, we're talking about unintentional. Now, unintentional, say someone really matters to me. I don't want to dishonor that relationship, but it was an accident. Okay, I didn't. No, I didn't mean it. It was a mistake. So, someone, the mistakes happen, without a doubt. But if my kids are all already, the youngest are teenagers, so they should be responsible for themselves. If they need to take a train because they're out of town and out of town schools, and they miss their train, so they can't get back to school, Mistakes happen. My question to them is if this was a train that was taking you to a day in the city with friends, a fun day in the city with friends, and a Yankee game, do you think the same thing would have happened? If you really think the same thing would have happened, you have to get to some time management courses. If that same thing wouldn't have happened, you can tell yourself that is that when you value something, you make sure to be there. A train is leaving. Once it's gone, it's gone. If you really need to make that train, you make sure to be there a bit early. And if you didn't make sure to be there a bit early, then maybe that reflects that you didn't really value where you were going. So sure, a mistake is a mistake, but it often reflects on our larger attitude to whatever the specific subject is, because we opened ourselves up to mistake because we weren't that careful, we weren't that conscious about it. And we all have that in our lives. So mistakes happen, but if mistakes happen often, if it's a mistake, we have to say, how did I let myself make that mistake? If my just to use the metaphor I used before, if my child is on the way to the train, but there was something, an unforeseen circumstance, a tornado or something that I got on that got in the way, and they just couldn't get there, that's not called a mistake. It's an unforeseeable accident. There's nothing. There's no lessons to learn, really. If you did everything right, then something happens, an unforeseeable act of God, or however we're going to frame it. But mistakes are things that we really should look at and see. Could I have been more conscious about this? Could I have taken it more seriously? Was I being too cavalier? And therefore, if I make a mistake, if someone dear to me asked me to pick up something important to them, and I picked up the wrong thing, or I forgot to pick it up, well, mistakes happen. People forget. I'm human. But it tells the person that it was just another part of my jumble in my head, and that's how I was able to forget it. If someone important to me asks me for something and it's important, I know it's important to them, it should be very important to me, and I shouldn't be on the phone, on my phone as I'm grabbing the things that I'm taking and forget. It should be a focus. So this is talking about unintentional violations of, and we're going to read again. The language is not as clear as I would prefer it. Maybe you won't have that issue, but the unintentional violations here are violations that took action. In other words, the Torah tells me Passover is coming. Torah tells me to eat matzah at the Seder. That's a positive commandment. The Torah also tells me not to eat bagels or bread on Passover. If I didn't eat matzah at the Seder, that's something I didn't do. The violation is something where there was no action. The commandment, the fulfillment would have been an action. Since I didn't do that action, that's something I have to work out with God, but there's no offering. But if what I did was I grabbed the bagel, so the violation itself took action. That's what we're talking about here, that there's a violation that took action, and with that type of a violation, one brings an offering, this sin offering. And this one specifically is talking about violations that have a specific penalty attached if one would have done it intentionally, which is called a karet, decision of the soul. We're not going to get into that right now. So, having established from the Torah here that souls do sin, and it doesn't say body, says souls, and their commentaries talk about it also. It's that our souls should know better. Our souls is our higher self. The bodily, obviously the body doesn't have its own consciousness, but we have a bodily consciousness. The appetites, the confusion, the static, the things we live with, that's more of a bodily persona. The soul should know better. There's a part of us that's unextinguishable, and if we would just pay attention to our deepest voice, the soul, then we would stay on the proper track, and therefore we're talking to the soul here, who does it doesn't they translate it as a person, which makes a lot of sense. I think it's a fine translation, but the Torah uses the word a soul. So let's go to 18, the Hasidic insights on the right side, which is where we're up to. If a person, literally a soul, the Hebrew word is nefesh, unintentionally transgresses, as has already been pointed out, the soul comprises 5 parts or levels. The Medrash and Kabbalah speak about 5 different dimensions of soul consciousness. Now, in each of us, there are different things we bring to the fore. When you're sleeping, you're alive. Your soul is operating. But when you're emoting, your soul is operating probably with more cylinders, you might say, than when you're sleeping. When you're thinking, when you're cogitating, when you're understanding, it's a different level than when you're feeling. And there's a different part of you kicking in. Then there's faith. There are different elements to how our soul operates, and which parts of our soul show themselves in a specific time of life or day, of our day. And there are 5 different parts of the soul. And the one that is the most functional, in other words, the most human oriented, physically oriented, is we call nefesh, which could be translated as a creature. Ruach is a word which means wind or spirit, but and that refers to more the emotive side of the soul. The neshama, which in the word neshama means to breathe. Neshima means to breathe. So that's the breath of life that God breathes our souls into us. That's the more cognitive. The chaya, which is the living being, and roughly speaking, this relates to our higher sense of faith. And the yichida. Yichida means unique one, where there's a sense within us that there's a connection, a oneness between us and God. Yichida is a feminine word, and we've discussed that Hebrew in the language that we don't have this in English. That the language breaks into masculine and feminine. So there's really no neutral, and it doesn't mean that it's a specific object is female, but linguistically we have the masculine and the feminine, and obviously women issues, feminine issues tend to be spoken to with the feminine language, and masculine with masculine language. Yichida, it means yachida means only. In other words, there's only one, but it's yichida. It's with that at the end means it's feminine, and the Kabbalah tells us that that is the core of our soul, and the core of our soul is that sense of where we feel totally and exclusively devoted to God. And that is our yichida, which bonds with yachid, which is the same word, but in the masculine. There's a godliness within our souls that bonds with our souls, like the masculine and the feminine. And so the divine yachid bonds with our yichida. The divine masculine oneness bonds with our feminine oneness, and that is the core of our identity, even if it's not conscious. So the nefesh is the lowest of the 5. It is this level that is referred to in connection to sin, for it is only in this level that can possibly stoop so as to transgress God's will. As I mentioned, I don't have to bring up public figures now by name, But if you think back, you'll probably be able to remember, because I certainly can, really, really smart people who really threw a very significant monkey wrench into their lives just because they went after a specific desire, which ultimately was passing. Why would they have done that? It's because they're on the functional level. Yes, our passions and our desires and our self-oriented drive, that really steers us and clouds out our higher thinking. So it's the lower vegetative, almost animalistic, not to knock animals, but animals are instinctive, and this is the more instinctive level. Is what can get us into trouble if we just follow our creature comfort instincts. In fact, even the nefesh isn't capable of sinning intentionally or unintentionally. Looking through the eyes of Jewish spirituality, and this is a very important Chabad idea, a Torah idea, but an idea that Chabad emphasizes a lot. Chabad thought that even the nefesh fundamentally does not want to be separate from God. In the words of Rabbi Shneur Zalman al-Ladi, the founder of Chabad, a Jew is by nature neither capable of sinning nor does he desire to do so. Now, we do violations all the time, but saying fundamentally, the soul. I mean, unfortunately, we do. That's just that, and it's been that way. It was since the Garden of Eden. So the soul is intrinsically connected with God, and any deviation from this connection on any level is unnatural. In other words, fundamentally, we want our own self-preservation. Fundamentally, we want the best for ourselves. Fundamentally, we want to be connected to our family. We have special people. I mean, there are things that we really want to be to where we want to be in a place that is best for us. Now, that isn't just our high-minded self. That's what we want. That's what really makes us happy. Yet, so that's even at the most basic level. We all want to be happy. We're happiest when everything's okay. So when a person follows their passion, instinctive passion to do something that hurts them, it's not okay even in the regular level. It's not like they tampered with something ethereal that they're just trying to forget. Life on the ground now has pain. Life on the ground has now been disrupted. It hurts the person who did it, without a doubt. So there, you'd think, even the functional level, a person would have a little bit more clarity, but it doesn't always work that way. I say the soul, it should have it. It's intrinsically connected with God. Any deviation from this connection at any level is unnatural. Therefore, even when this lowliest level of the soul is unfaithful, God is shocked. Like I said before, that word God, it's bewildered. How then do we sin? Talmud states a person does not commit a sin unless he's been overcome by a spirit of folly. As I mentioned before, it's our foolishness that clouds the mind and allows us to do stupid things, and people do. Meaning that the evil inclination has convinced the person that even upon sinning will not be disconnected from God. This misconception allows the individual to stray. What happens when a person is doing something? They think it's all going to be okay. It's not going to be okay. What you're doing now is going to hurt a loved one, whatever it is. You may tell yourself it's your weaker side, it's your passion saying, don't worry about it. It's good. It's going to be great. It's so tantalizing. So in our minds, we'll work everything out. It doesn't always work out. And a person says that with regard to God too. God's going to understand. God understands, but God understands that what you did was you set aside the value of a wholesome relationship with God for an appetite. So God is a parent, and a parent forgives, and so on. But the idea is still there. It's that we are convincing ourselves that it's okay, and that's one of the reasons we bring an offering. This is more talking about the framing is more an intentional one, but what the in here that what Torah is talking about is an unintentional transgression. They're also to look into ourselves and see how did we allow our focus and our where we live emotionally and humanly to be at such a point where we could unintentionally violate the Torah. And if you think about it, in our lives, let's say you keep kosher. Okay, so it's a value. I keep kosher, and many people do. So that's a value. So someone, I'm at someone's house, and they say this is a piece of sushi, which is it's wrapped in rice, but it's salmon, which is a kosher fish. So you eat it. Then they say, "Oops, that was crab. It's a mistake. It's not your fault." At the same time, you don't know. You didn't see the wrapper, so you're relying on someone. If there were a few cups in a workshop, and some of them had water, and the others had ammonia and bleach, and someone hands you a cup and says, "Here's water," you check, especially if you know that there's bleach and ammonia, and you smell it, you sure it's water, because self-preservation is a clear value. You don't want to do something just because someone told you. Say they said it's water. You know that there's bleach and ammonia around. I think a human tendency would be to be more careful about a danger we see clear. If there's any of us drinking, God forbid, ammonia or bleach will hurt us, and we're gonna have to go get our stomach pumped or whatever. And if I eat the crab, so it's a mistake, but we don't see any effects. So I think that it would be somewhat common, normal human thinking to be a little laxer on things like that. And Torah is saying, if you think about things looking through a spiritual lens, what the Torah tells us is not good for us. That's bleach for the soul. You have to be just as careful. And if something unavoidable happens, a mistake happens, mistakes are mistakes, but it shouldn't be because we were more lax. Okay, now we're going to do this, actually, the closer look, but I want to read again. I believe we did 2 already, but I want to do verse 2 so that we can understand a little bit more about a closer look. Verse 2, on top of page 18, right under the sin offering of the high priest. Actually, let's just start with 1. 5th reading. God spoke to Moses saying, with the exception of the 2 obligatory offerings briefly mentioned above, our discussion has thus far been of voluntary offerings. Now turn to the subject of obligatory offerings. And now in the bold, what the verse says is, speak to the Israelites saying, there are 2 types of offerings whose purpose is to counteract the effects of wrongdoing. The sin offering and the guilt offering. We're going to get into those. We're going to start with the sin offering. Both of these types of sacrifices counteract only specific types of sins, as will be described, but of the 2, the sin offering is more general, will therefore be discussed first. If a person unintentionally transgresses any of the passive commandments of God, I believe what they mean by passive commandments are the commandments in which God told us don't do that. In other words, don't eat a bagel on Pesach. And he or she must sacrifice a sin offering. If the punishment for transgressing the passive commandment would be excision, dying prematurely, or childless, were committed intentionally. In other words, what would it be if it was intentional? So now that it's unintentional, there would be the sin offering. And B, he either completed one of these acts or committed part of one of them, provided the partial act was also a complete act in its own right. And that's what I didn't think is so understandable. And then just to finish this piece, also the sin offering and the circumstances that occasion it differ for a high priest, Sanhedrin, a king, or a commoner as follows. As I mentioned, they're bundled into this next piece is about these accidental, these unintentional offerings for unintentional sins, but for people like me and you, then for the high priest, the king, and for the great court. If there are mistakes made at all those levels. But let's start, we're still in the personal issue here. So what they're referring to in the idea of when it said the partial act was also a complete act in its own right. The way it shows itself in Jewish law, the clearest way that this shows up in Jewish law is relatively simple. One of the things that in the laws of Shabbos, we have a bunch of different types of external creativity which we're prohibited to do. One of them is writing. But writing is biblically the only type of writing that's prohibited is writing that is creative. All of these things are constructive. All the things that we talk about that we don't do Shabbos are things that are constructive. So if there's a flame burning and I'm just, I'm sitting here studying and I'm kind of absent-minded or whatever, and I put a tissue into the fire. I burn it. That's not constructive. That's destructive. Destroying the tissue. So biblically, I actually haven't violated anything, unless I need the ashes. Because then what I'm doing is I'm not burning tissue. I'm creating ashes. I'm creating ashes. That's a violation of Torah. So there's the creativity. The Torah wants us on Shabbos. I don't want to get into Shabbos too much now, but Torah wants us on Shabbos to unplug from our normal, divinely oriented mission of being creative in the world, and being useful to the world, and changing the world. And we change the world 6 days a week. And on Shabbos, we unplug and we leave the world alone, and we soak in the beauty of what it is we do and the world that God gave us. So since there are creative types of behaviors are the ones that are prohibited, say writing is one that I'm not supposed to write. What happens if I scribble? Biblically, I didn't do anything wrong. Rabbinically, I shouldn't scribble either, because once you scribble, you're already crossing a line that could lead to the biblical. So rabbinically, we don't write at all. But biblically, we're talking about here biblical violations. If I just scribble, there's nothing wrong with it. So if I wanted to write the name Helen, and I wrote H-E-L. H-E-L doesn't mean anything. So if that's the case, if I wrote H-E-L, it's not a partial violation. It's not a violation. I meant to write a word that means something, Helen, which if I would have finished writing Helen, that would be a violation. But H-E-L doesn't mean anything. What if I wanted to write Mendy, and I wrote only M-E-N? M-E-N is men. It does mean something. So even though I didn't finish what I intended to, the creative act that I intended to do was to write Mendy, and I didn't finish it. And the intent and creativity is important. The fact is that since what I did was itself creative, it was half of what I meant, or only part of what I meant, but it in itself it's M-E-N means something. That is a violation, a biblical violation of the prohibition of writing, and therefore writing that would be a case where I would be able, if I did that unintentionally, I would bring an offering, the violation offering we're talking about. So let's take a look at a closer look on the right side, number 2. A partial act that is a complete act in its own right. For example, writing words is prohibited on the Sabbath. If a person forgot that it was the Sabbath, or forgot that writing is prohibited on the Sabbath, and intended to write the name Daniel, but instead only wrote the name Dan, he or she is liable to bring a sin offering, since Dan is also a word. Right, so that's partial, but it's a partial act that it's a complete act in its own right. If, however, the person intended to write Reuben and only wrote Re, he or she is exempted from having to bring a sin offering, since Re is not a word. Now, by rabbinic prohibition, even writing a non-word is forbidden, but transgressing a rabbinic prohibition does not obligate the transgressor to bring a sin offering. Okay. So now we've gone into the idea of us as souls, the idea of transgressing, that we do cross the line because we're not thinking straight, because we allow our instincts and passions to get in the way, to distract us. And if we do something unintentionally, even though you'd say it's a mistake and we all make mistakes, that's true. But the idea of us looking at our mistakes and saying, how did that happen? How do I make sure it doesn't happen again? That is an important part of the process. It's not just because we have an out as far as being held liable for something. We should look and say, but how did that thing happen? What could I have done to prevent that mistake? Because if I'm truly dissatisfied, bothered by the result, I don't want it to happen again. It's not only that someone else is upset with me, I don't like it. And I want to look and see how could I have planned my life differently? How could I have pursued my steps differently so that I wouldn't be in a position where this mistake can happen? We set up our own safeguards. Okay. So as I mentioned, this section is going to go also not only into personal violations, but into leadership violations. So I want to read this and then we'll discuss it a little bit. Let's just read it through. Number 3. If the anointed high priest commits the same sin. Okay, so we said what happens, the highest spiritual functionary for many centuries in Jewish life was not only the Kohen, but the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. The high priest does a sin, as will be described presently, or implicates the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of the people. The Sanhedrin made a mistake. They made a mistake, and they told the people that something's permitted when it shouldn't be permitted. They also made the mistake, obligating them to bring a sin offering. We'll just read it through and then we'll go back. Specifically, if here we're going to the Kohen Gadol, if he mistakenly concludes and rules that a particular act is permitted, when in fact it is both prohibited and punishable by excision performed intentionally, and then commits the act relying on his mistaken conclusion, then when his mistake is discovered, in order to atone for his sin that he has unwittingly committed, he must bring an unblemished young bull between 1 and 3 years old as a sin offering to God. The Kohen Gadol says, it doesn't really, it says, yeah, if you're writing only Mendy, you're writing only a name, that's okay, Shabbos. That's what he thought. For whatever reason, he made a mistake. And that's probably a little silly to imagine, but something where he should have known better, but he didn't. He forgot. When the mistake is discovered, in order to atone for sin, when the committee must bring an unblemished young bull between 1 and 3 years old as a sin offering to God. Now, however, if the high priest knew that the act was forbidden but simply committed unintentionally, he is not required to bring a sin offering at all, unlike the leader or a layperson. This is details I'm not sure we want to get into, but I'll sum it up soon. Who are required to bring a sin offering when they either did not know the act is forbidden, or knew the act is forbidden but did not realize that what doing was a forbidden act, or knew that the act is forbidden but did not know that is punishable by excision. If, however, they concluded erroneously that a specific act is permitted when in fact it's forbidden, and then committed the act relying on their erroneous conclusion, they're not liable to bring a sin offering. So there are going to be details there. When we say unintentional, it could be several ways. Unintentional can be that someone doesn't know. Someone comes in here. I've had people come in and they say that they want to write a check at Shabbos. They mean well, but that's something they just don't know. You're not supposed to write on Shabbos. But that's one little type of not knowing. What happens if someone knows? They just forgot on Shabbos. So they know the act is not permitted on Shabbos, but just forget the Shabbos. Or in this specific case, they don't know the gravity and know the Torah consequences for it. That's all. Those are all things that render the act unintentional in Torah thinking. So now, when it comes to leadership, there's sort of variables about. Not all of those are going to obligate an offering as a non-intentional offering. But I don't know if we want to get into that. They bring it here because Rashi brings some of them. But let's just finish off this piece. When the anointed high priest sins, it reinforces the people's guilt. Since, as it will be explained later, they rely on him to atone for them by performing the Yom Kippur rites, and he lacks the merit to do so if he himself is tainted by sin. In contrast, since he represents the notion of atonement for sin, when the people see him atoning for his inadvertent sin, it impresses them with the necessity to atone for their own sin, even their inadvertent ones, and following this example, they will not be ashamed to do so. Again, I want to pick this apart, and what they put in here, I wouldn't necessarily put everything in, but one thing for sure that there is a very, very important sense of responsibility to those in leadership to acknowledge their failings, their mistakes, and make it better. Now, that's a responsibility that lies on all of us. It's a human responsibility, it's a total responsibility. But how much more so those in leadership? And we'll get back to that. Well, I just want to finish this and we'll get back to it. Those in leadership have a special responsibility to do it, because that type of behavior of owning up to mistakes can inspire those the leader is leading to also say, well, if that leader who's a leader feels the responsibility, has the guts to own up to a mistake, must be a real value, and I should do that in my own life. It must bring, number 4, it must bring the bull to the entrance of the tent of meeting, thus being considered to have presented it before God. It must lean his hands forcefully upon the bull's head and slaughter the bull before God within the precincts of the courtyard of the temple. And that's one of the things we're going to find, that these are things that are brought the entrance of the tent of meeting. We're not looking in general to advertise people's sin offerings, even though it's an inadvertent sin. It's between them and God. When it comes to leaders, public figures, we actually do it publicly, not to embarrass them, God forbid, but so that they have the opportunity and they show their willingness to own up to mistakes, because that's their responsibility. It's especially a responsibility on a leader, as I said, and to be able to use that as a teachable moment. Number 5, the anointed high priest must receive the blood in a consecrated vessel and take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tent of meeting. Standing inside the sanctuary, the outer chamber of the tabernacle, and facing the curtain that divides the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies, the inner chamber, the priest must dip his finger into the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before God through the holy part of the curtain, part directly in front of the ark. I'm going to just read this through. We can ask, if you can ask any questions if you like, and then I want to just talk about it. This being the 2.5 cubit space between the slight protrusions in the curtain caused by the ark's 2 poles. The blood does not have to reach the curtain, but if some of it does not thereby invalidate the procedure. The priest must then place some of the blood on the 4 protrusions of the incense altar, which is located inside the tent of meeting, directly in front of the place where God's presence is revealed, which means directly in front of the ark. If he omits one of these blood applications intentionally or inadvertently, the rite is invalidated. He must then exit the tent of meeting and pour all the rest of the bull's blood onto the base of the altar and use the altar used for scent offerings, meaning the outer altar specifically onto the side of the base that faces the entrance of the tent of meeting, the west side. Before cutting the bull into pieces, it must remove all the sin offerings, bull's fat, meaning the following 7 parts from it: the fat covering the innards, on the mesom and the reticulum, all the fat that's on the innards, on the abamesim, and alternatively on the small intestine, the 2 kidneys, the fat is on the flanks. It must also remove the diaphragm along with the kidneys, as stated, along with part of the liver. And I just for the the symmetry of it, let's just finish these 3 verses on page 20, and then we'll go back. Just as with the fat parts that are removed from the bull sacrifice as a peace offering, the priest must then burn them up on the altar used for scent offerings, doing so specifically with the intention to be a fire offering, meaning that destined to be consumed by fire, and that it be pleasing to God. The high priest's sin offering is similar to a peace offering, which we spoke about already, also in that it promotes peace between God and the people. For as mentioned previously, until the high priest has atoned for his own sin, he cannot effect atonement for the people. Regarding the bull's hide, all of its flesh, its head, its legs, its innards, and its waist, You must take all of this, the entire bull, save for the parts burned up on the altar, to an undefiled place outside the camp, namely to the place designated, as will be explained later, as the ash depository, and you must burn it up there in the fire on wood. It must be burned up in this ash depository, even if there happens to be no ashes there, no part of the high priest's sin offering may be eaten. Okay. Having said all that, we have here the idea of a high priest. And we're going to get more now into the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a Greek word, but that was the high court of 71 sages that really they established, they had the final word on Jewish practice. Great sages, great Torah scholars, able to make a mistake. And that's going to be the next one. It's over in the Sanhedrin. This one is about the high priest, who is the greatest functionary that we have, and the person made a mistake. So in Jewish thinking, in Torah thinking, there is a very intimate relationship and between leader and people, and those being led. Leader has responsibilities. Is really they're the Torah leader. I'm not talking about today's political leaders, but the Torah leader has really is totally consumed with responsibilities to the people. That's what the focus of their lives. So in their relationship with in the leader's relationship with the people, each one actually impacts the other, because it's a very tight relationship. So on the one hand, right, a good leader hopefully leads the people in the right direction. When a leader makes a mistake, the ripple effects are that much worse, because it impact people. And set standards for people, or lower standards for people. I mean, I think that I don't want to make this a big conversation just from my personal. I'm not saying this is a Torah view, but just because I'm alive and I observe and formulate opinions. I feel that our national level of conversation is not in a good place, where we're able to disagree without being disagreeable. We're not able to disagree, have different viewpoints, and respect each other. And I think that a lot of that comes from the top of how our political leaders talk about each other. And I'm talking about all sides of the spectrum. It filters down, and it's really troublesome to me, and it's because a leader is in a position of leading, and whether consciously or not, we hear what they're saying, and we're impacted by leaders very often in a way that we're not impacted by peers. The leader is also impacted by people. And we find that in Torah thought, that it's difficult to be a principled leader when the people are pulling in a different direction. So there is a Torah idea which might seem to bump up against what we're reading here. There's the Mishnah tells us in the Talmud that when a person is a person who is working on trying to increase public welfare. In other words, they're a public servant. They're a leader in that sense. God protects them. They have special protection so that there's nothing negative coming out of what they're doing. Their intention is correct. The intention is to do the right thing. So God gives them protection. Now, we just said that leaders can make mistakes, and they can make mistakes. But I think that the idea is that no one no one has free choice taken away from them. And even if God is adding special protections to keep us away from mistakes, if we're, if we're just not listening and we're not paying attention to that, and we're running headlong into making a mistake, we'll make a mistake despite God's protections. But the idea is that God puts it out there for leaders, a special sense of protection if they're exerting themselves to try to help the public, sincerely exerting themselves to try to help the public. God will provide extra protection so they don't mess up. Here, it did mess up, and one of there are actually two different ways of looking at it, and we'll have it there later also. On the one hand, partially this is looked at and say it's possible, and we find it in the language of it, but I'm not going to point it out. It's more in the Hebrew that when the high priest has violated this unintentional violation, it may very well be because the people got to him, because he's been trying and they're pulling in a different direction, and therefore he has ultimately become a little less sensitive to spiritual values because he's leading a people who are less sensitive. There's another way of interpreting it, of reading this, because the verse does connect his sin to the people, even though the people didn't do anything, he did something. And that is how his mistake is compounded because of the reverberations it could have within the people. And I think that one of the things that's really inescapable from this whole section, and again, we're going to continue further, is about the tremendous beauty and opportunity and the tremendous gravity of being in leadership, Torah-wise. Leadership in Torah thinking is not getting high office because of power or some type of gain that will come out of that. That's really really anathema to the idea of Torah leadership. Torah leadership is about surrendering one's personal aspirations to be able to devote oneself to communal welfare, because one feels that they have something they can bring to the table where others will benefit, and therefore one is willing to forego one's personal gain in order to be able to leverage one's talent so that more people can benefit through the being what we're going to call a leader. And the humility is actually like the number one. It's a little hard to think of it that way, just if we look at our common idea of a leader, but humility is seen as the number one the characteristic. Obviously one has to be talented, but humility is the number one characteristic in the sense that the person is surrendering oneself to a higher good, to the public good, to God's will and to the public good. So these people who are in leadership, you and I, we make mistakes, and the Torah lays out what we do, and God understands us, and then we go through our lives, hopefully forgiving ourselves and recognizing that everybody makes mistakes and learning from our mistakes and going forward. And that's the most God can ask of us. There is a more specific and in a way a higher category of mistakes made by those in leadership, because they have to be handled with the same responsibility. If I make a mistake and no one knows about it, I have no reason to tell anyone about it. It's between me and God, and maybe I'm embarrassed by it. I don't have. Why should I tell you? I will do whatever I can to confess to God and to repent and strengthen my behavior. If it was between me and one person, I will go say something to them. I have to go say something. I have to go ask for forgiveness. But it's between us. No one else needs to know. These, it doesn't work that way so much because, again, as I said before, with public figures, mistakes are also public, and they have a responsibility to use it, to use the opportunity as a teaching opportunity of how to deal with our mistakes. So unless there are questions, I'll leave it over there. Yes.
Yes. There's a saying, where the leader goes, people follow, and that's very true.
Yeah, sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's not. Yeah. Actually, someone's asked in the chat. Oh, okay. All right.
Thank you.
Wish everyone a great week. Be well.
Hey, thank you.